2 minutes to go. Please take your seats, fasten your seatbelts, please. I think we have had already a very productive day, and it's my turn now to introduce the next moderator. And our last session for today will address the status of the regulatory framework, which is necessary to support the growth and development mentioned in the session before. For this, we have another person who is very well known to ICAO, Mr. Vladimir Zubkov, as I said, my friend. I'm very proud of being friend. Vladimir actually is Secretary General of the International Air Cargo Association, global trade association representing all major segments of the air cargo and air logistic industry. He started his career at Sheremetyevo International Airport, later working for Aeroflot in different management positions, both headquarters and abroad. In ICAO, he was director of the Air Transport Bureau and director planning and global coordination. After that, he went back to industry as a vice president of Volga-Dnieper group of companies, the major air cargo enterprise. Vladimir, please lead us to the next panel session.
Thank you, Katarina. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Katarina not only for the introduction, but mainly for the skillful running of the panel. And also I would like to thank all the panel members from the previous session, because indeed it was the picture painted for us in which we will put our regulatory issues. Talking about the regulatory issues, Leslie, before the break, asked how many people are from the regulatory side and from the manufacturer side and from the panel. And I would like to ask, are there any users? Of course, the United Nations is one of the big users. 2006, Miss Cary was with the US FAA. She spent 14 years as an air traffic controller at Anchorage and 6 years at FAA headquarters facilitating implementation of various international ATM and CNS initiatives. I would like to invite you to welcome Leslie Cary to the podium. Leslie.
Thank you. Now I'm on the other side of this. And just to clarify, I cannot say that I have any expertise whatsoever in RPAS. I really hardly even know what they look like, but I know an awful lot about standards development here at ICAO and trying to facilitate this whole program. So I have learned immense things since coming here. But as an air traffic controller from an en route facility, all aircraft look the same on radar. So I'm going to fill you in a bit on the status of the regulatory framework that we are working on here. You'll be hearing other presentations from me this week on other aspects of the work that's underway, but this symposium is focused on the RPAS side, the high end. So some of the things that I want to clarify before we go into this any further is unmanned aircraft are aircraft. Whether it's an unmanned aircraft, a civil aircraft, a military aircraft, a fast aircraft, a slow aircraft, unmanned is just an adjective added to the word aircraft. The machine going up in the air is an aircraft. It's not a system, and it's really important for us to understand that that machine up in the air is an aircraft. Because when we're trying to develop standards, the words are extremely important. So, looking at an unmanned aircraft versus remotely piloted aircraft. So it's still just a machine going up in the air. But we have all sorts of unmanned aircraft. They include free balloons, meteorological balloons, and others. And we have standards here at ICAO on how those are to be classified and operated. We also talk about model aircraft, which stay entirely outside the purview of ICAO, happily. Remotely piloted aircraft, where we're looking at full integration into airspace and procedures alongside manned aircraft operating in the same type of way. So having control in real time by a licensed remote pilot. And then we talk about drones here, which is a recent addition to our work program. But unmanned aircraft, for anybody who's spent any time around them, do know from pictures, if nothing else, that they come in all shapes and sizes, that they may look absolutely nothing like what we are used to as aircraft. They can be big, they can be small, any manned aircraft can be converted into an unmanned aircraft, remotely piloted. So the breadth of potential aircraft is really immense. So we have two approaches to the work program here at ICAO. One is the RPAS, which is our traditional approach. We have all of the annexes that we look at, and we have all the standards that we are working to develop. It's a very long process that we go through. And then we have the other side, everything else that's not within our current scope of work on RPAS, we just say other. And you'll hear a lot about that other part Friday and Saturday. But with all of our work here, what we're trying to do is look at where the risk is, how to mitigate the risk, and build performance-based standards around that risk and the mitigations. In manned aviation, anytime you have an aircraft flying, you have a minimum one person whose life is at risk, that of the pilot. There may be a lot of others as well that are at risk. With unmanned aircraft, we may not have anyone whose life is at risk, which means we can look at the operation and at the aircraft in new ways to determine what is the risk, how do we mitigate it, what can be approved, where an operation may occur versus where it cannot occur, and ensure safety. So with the RPAS work program, under the Chicago Convention that rules us here in this building, we have 19 annexes. 18 of those 19 annexes are affected by the introduction of unmanned aviation. The only one that we are leaving out, and I hope it stays this way, units of measurement. Please do not invent anything new that we have to deal with in terms of units of measurement and touch that one last annex. My goal is to leave it completely as it is. Now, earlier I had the participants in the RPAS panel stand up. We have over 100 people that normally attend meetings. One of them here with me. We have a lot of different working groups that are all developing standards, and they're doing that in a very interactive way. The standards themselves are very interdependent. So when we're talking about airworthiness or operations, the C2 link, air traffic management and separation standards, operation within airspace, the decisions taken by any one of those working groups has a direct impact on the work of the other working groups. So we have very large meetings that break up into 6, 7, or potentially more different working groups that interact with each other throughout the week. And then we also have to interact with a lot of the other panels here. We don't have all the expertise within the RPAS panel. We work with the Frequency Spectrum Management panel, communications, air traffic management operations, aerodromes and airworthiness, communications and surveillance. There are a lot of other expertises that are involved. And all of these come within the Air Navigation Bureau of ICAO. So that's one department here out of several. We get the fun work. But at the moment, our schedule for the work panel, or the RPAS panel, with its work deliverables, we have licensing and training, and that's the main focus of this event. We'll be hearing a lot about that tomorrow. We have the standards and recommended practices and guidance material, all of which are going through the approval process now. The panel developed the proposals. We took them to our Air Navigation Commission, who reviewed them quite thoroughly with a lot of discussion and debate. And then we sent them out to states for comment. All those comments have come back in, we've analyzed them, and in early November we will be presenting all the results back to the Air Navigation Commission with the goal of having the Council of ICAO actually adopt those new SARPs in March of 2018. So we're getting very close on those. Other ones, operations. We're developing a full new annex on operations of remotely piloted aircraft. That will be hopefully taken forward for adoption in 2020. Then we have airworthiness and C2 link, ATM, as well as detect and avoid SARPs for conflicting traffic. So all of that is currently in the works. We also do a lot of other work outside of the RPAS panel and outside of the Air Navigation Bureau. The legal committee has the analysis of legal aspects related to UAS as their #1 priority on their work program. The Committee on Aviation and Environmental Protection is looking at noise requirements. The Aviation Security Panel is actively engaged, looking both at physical as well as cyber aspects. Then the Air Navigation Services Economics Panel and Aerodrome Economics Panel. They both look at the funding mechanisms for aviation infrastructure. So with that, I just want to say that this is all evolving incredibly quickly. But for people like Oves working at the UN and other operators looking to actually conduct operations, we know it is painfully slow. So we're doing our best. We are very conscious of the need for getting all of these forward. But the complexity of unmanned aviation will absolutely be challenging all of our traditional thoughts and processes. So we need to be looking at some new methods going forward. And finally, states are encouraged to establish and adopt performance-based regulations. And we encourage them to be working collaboratively, particularly across regions, so that within Asia Pacific, you have a common framework going forward. Africa, Europe, each of the regions should have a lot of commonality in how they're approaching this. And we will try to bring that umbrella from ICAO headquarters in as rapidly as we can. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, and forgive me, I remain seated only because of the microphone.
Oh, it's not a...
Not on?
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you, Leslie, and once again, sorry, I remain seated only because of the microphone. While the memory is fresh, I would like to ask you a couple of questions. On the slide 10, there was a table with 19 annexes, and you said 18 of them are relevant for the RPAS. I was wondering, though I'm preempting, of course, the next cycle will be related in 2 days will be related to the drones, but drones and other small unmanned aircraft, are they also covered by the same, or will they be covered by the same 18 annexes, or they are treated differently?
Oh, that's actually a good one. The smaller drones will not be covered within the annexes. There's a simple reason for that. There are articles of the convention that, generally speaking, a 25-kilo drone or a 2-kilo drone will never be able to comply with, at least not in any realistic way. They also will not be complying with the rules of the air as those rules are written. So if they cannot comply, we can't put them under the convention and the annexes. We have to keep them off to the side. So our current strategy is that we will be developing guidance material, and that guidance material will be the basis for the harmonization amongst states. We will have to see in the future if that is sufficient or if states need more than just guidance from ICAO, in which case there will have to be some good discussions in the Council and the Assembly.
I can only encourage developments in such a way that the small commercial aircraft would not be put in the same category, because it will probably not allow to use them for commerce, especially for the e-commerce, which is widely growing and 20–30% a year. So we badly need this as commercial aviation. And my last question, while you are standing here, you had the final thoughts, and there was something like states are encouraged to establish. And my question is, how are you going to achieve uniformity? That's, to me, a very dear question, especially since the very last slide was showing the 7 regional offices, and I cannot see regional representatives here. Thank you.
Yes, we did have some of our regional directors here earlier today, but they have left the room. What we are encouraging is that the regional directors bring the states of their regions together and try and facilitate some of the development work, particularly as it relates to the smaller drones as opposed to RPAS. So we've really separated out the two categories. RPAS that require the standards that are developed here at headquarters versus the real work going on in most states that has to address the operation of small drones. So the states can be working together under the facilitation of the regional offices. And we have workshops that we've put together from here that we go out and teach around the regions, targeted particularly at regulators, but as well industry, ANSPs, trying to get everybody up to a certain level of understanding that is common. So we need that common level of understanding, which includes common use of terminology. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Now we turn to Michael Brown from the United States FAA. Michael serves as an aviation safety analyst and advisor to the head of the FAA's General Aviation and Commercial Division. He brings with him over 25 years of experience as an aviation practitioner, advocate, and regulator. He leads his organization international activities. Prior to this, Mike served a 4-year tour as the FAA senior representative in Brazil, being there as a technical resource to governments, corporations, and individuals with aeronautical interest in the U.S. and South America. Mr. Brown is educated in Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and Eastern Michigan University. He is also an active pilot and flight instructor. Michael, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today in beautiful and thankfully sunny Montreal. Just by way of a quick background, again, I work in the FAA's General Aviation and Commercial Division. As you probably suspect, a lot of our unmanned aerial systems work crosses many lines of business within the FAA, including aircraft certification, air traffic control, flight procedures, and personnel licensing. My organization works with subject matter experts in all these groups within the FAA, but specifically it is our group that has stewardship over the new Part 107, which is our small Unmanned Aerial Systems Rule. We share a common goal with ICAO and other regulators throughout the world. That is a comprehensive regulatory and procedural framework that will maximize the utility and safety of all aircraft operating in our national airspace system, including those operated remotely. In terms of regulatory efforts, ICAO's focus has largely been on RPAS operations in controlled airspace undertaken by certificated aircraft and flown by a licensed pilot. And this is entirely appropriate given ICAO's focus and mission. The complexity of operating and integrating RPAS operations seamlessly into an IFR environment certainly requires a great deal of attention and focus from regulators throughout the world. And we believe, as I'm sure you do, that ICAO is the appropriate forum to have those discussions. The FAA focus, however, has largely been on the opposite end of the spectrum, as I suspect it is in a lot of your countries. Our focus, at least initially by way of Part 107, has been building a regulatory structure that will accommodate the operation of small unmanned aircraft operated in day VFR conditions within visual sight of the operator. We chose this path for a number of reasons, not the least of which being that it was these small aircraft that created the greatest and most immediate safety concerns for us as regulators. The sheer volume of these aircraft, made possible by their low price point and consumer appeal, combined with their performance capabilities, compelled us to take action. We were facing a situation where we had literally tens of thousands of operators who suddenly had access to the national airspace system with no particular safety training or understanding of the threat that they posed to traditional manned aircraft operations. So this was an area we wanted to address as soon as we possibly could. More importantly, I think in the context of the discussion about where we ultimately want to go, we felt that this laid a foundation, an important one, for more complex operations that will come later on down the road, particularly operations over people, operations beyond visual line of sight, as a precursor to full IFR operations. As our experience in such matters grow, we expect this will take us to the obvious endpoint, which is the type of operations that we've discussed here today, the type that are being contemplated by ICAO. And to this end, the FAA continues to engage in international forums such as JARUS, the ICAO RPAS panel, and others. And our hope and our expectation is that the regulatory framework resulting from all these activities will ultimately lead to a unified and harmonious environment similar to what we now see in the traditionally piloted aircraft world. I included this slide to better highlight the sense of urgency associated with the regulation of small UAS in the United States. We have here two forecasts. The high number indicates, or the high line indicates a forecast that was done by the FAA as part of its registration rulemaking effort, and the bottom one was an estimate provided by the Teal Group. Obviously, there's a pretty significant gap there, and we understand that the reality of the entrance into the system will lie somewhere in between those numbers. But we also understand, too, that even the most conservative estimate puts 100,000 new aircraft, albeit small, UAS into the system, and that presents a significant challenge and certainly a safety concern for us as regulators. But before I dive too deeply into Part 107 and the items that are addressed within it, it's probably worthwhile to take a moment to discuss a little bit about what is not covered in Part 107. The FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 prevented the FAA from regulating model aircraft weighing less than 25 kilograms, as long as these aircraft were used for hobby or recreational purposes only and operated in accordance with a community-based set of standards established by the Academy of Model Aeronautics. This frees this community of model operators from the registration and licensing requirements of Part 107. So getting back to 107, our small UAS rule, I'm just going to go through some of the highlights here very quickly. As I said before, it's a day VFR operational rule within line of sight, applies to aircraft weighing less than 25 kilograms. We limit the maximum altitude to 400 feet above ground level, the only exception to that being outside of the waiver process. If the aircraft is operated within the shadow of a structure, then we allow it to operate beyond that 400-foot HEL level. Maximum speed of 100 miles an hour or 87 knots. The UAS cannot be flown over anyone who is not directly participating in the operation, nor may they be flown under any kind of structure so as to be out of the pilot's unaided line of sight. Operations within Class G are allowed without any kind of air traffic authorization, but for any other types of authorization or any types of airspace, an authorization from air traffic control is required. The exception there is within Class E airspace, again, as mentioned on the previous slide. If operated within the shadow of an existing structure, then an air traffic control authorization is not required. Under 107, operators are also permitted to carry an external load as long as it doesn't seriously or adversely affect the flight characteristics or controllability of the aircraft. Operators are permitted under this rule to transport property for compensation or hire on an intrastate basis, and small UAS, of course, are not required to comply with airworthiness standards or hold any sort of airworthiness certificate. Part 107 also contains within it, and I think that this is really important for our growth as regulators and for the industry, a variety of waiver options for those operators who can demonstrate a means by which to achieve an equivalent level of safety as provided for by the rule. These provisions are written into the rule because we knew that the evolving state of play in terms of technical and procedural advancements would not allow us, at least in this initial rule, to keep pace with the evolving industry, and it was very important for us not to stifle the industry's growth. Of equal importance, we wanted to codify a process by which we could work with the regulated community to develop strategies for expanded operation by UAS in our national airspace system. And to give you some idea of the amount of work and demand that this has imposed upon the FAA, we have processed to date over 5,100 waiver requests. Of these, just over 1,000 have been approved, and just over 3,800 have been denied. And I think that latter number demonstrates that collectively we still are learning, and we've got a ways to go before we reach full maturity, but certainly every waiver request and process brings with it new knowledge that we can hopefully leverage to move things forward later on. We've also established within Part 107 pilot certification rules. To operate the controls of a UAS under Part 107, a person needs to be at least 16 years of age or be under the supervision of someone who holds a remote pilot certificate. Pilots are also required to hold a remote pilot airman certificate with a UAS rating. And in order to gain this certificate, a person must pass an initial aeronautical knowledge test at an approved FAA knowledge testing center. So it's a much more formal knowledge test, just as you would see in the traditionally piloted world. If, however, an applicant already holds a pilot certificate, they need only take a current course online and they can gain their certificate that way. And to date, the FAA has issued over 61,000 remote pilot certificates. So it, again, gives you a sense of where the demand lies. So the big question everyone wants answered is what's next? And of course, that's a short question with a very complicated sense of answers. Getting back to waivers, because I do think it plays an important part in where we're going. It's a very important provision that we codified, and the waiver process not only gives industry an opportunity to gain privileges beyond what is currently provided for in the rule, it also gives us as regulators an opportunity to determine the public's true needs and to identify the mitigation strategies necessary to make these operations safe for the participating and non-participating public. We do this not only to accommodate the current needs, but also to identify things that we wish to codify in regulations later on, certainly moving toward the goal, as Leslie mentioned, of developing more sensible performance-based regulations. For example, operations over people and night operations are two of the conditions for which most of the waivers are sought. 70% of the waiver requests that come to the FAA are for night operations. And both of these make a lot of sense because both of them afford a lot of commercial opportunities, which is important to the operating community. And also, of course, the inability to operate over people is a pretty significant restriction. The FAA is in the process of developing a rule that will address these two operational areas, and we expect to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking by the end of the calendar year. This rule will capture some of the conditions and limitations the FAA has promulgated through its waiver processes, such as additional training requirements for operators. The end goal, the place where we need to ultimately be to make possible our IFR operations, is beyond visual line of sight operations. As anyone connected to this program, to JARUS, to the RPAS panel can attest, this is an area that's full of technical challenges. The FAA itself has not reached a point where we have a rulemaking project initiated yet. However, we have taken steps to identify and address potential roadblocks. One of the most important steps that we've taken is the development of a program we call Partnership for Safety. This is a mechanism that allows us to work with the industry, mostly operators and manufacturers, to work through the regulatory, procedural, technical, and operational issues associated with this regime of flight. Absent such a program, it would be many more years before we reach the level of maturity necessary to move forward with enabling rules. So as you can see, our regulatory path in the arena of UAS has been very deliberate and methodical, starting with the most simple operations undertaken in the most low-risk environment. We continue to build upon this foundation, and as we encounter challenges, we seek operator-focused answers, and we do this through constant outreach to our industry partners. This model, which has been developed and refined within the traditional flight operation community, has demonstrated a history of success, and we see no reason to abandon it now. Equally important to our success, and we see, and again, this is something that we've learned over the years, is collaboration with ICAO and other civil aviation regulators throughout the world. And to this end, we look forward to everyone, working with everyone in the international community to achieve our collective goals. My sincere thanks for your time and attention, and look forward to working with you in the future. Take care.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. Also, a couple of questions. Last week, it was a very successful conference on aviation security here. And while everybody in this building is still talking about it, I would like to ask you how much attention and in which form do you pay to the aviation security issues in the FAA in connection with what you discussed? Thank you.
I may not be the best person to ask, but I'll take a stab at it just the same. Within the United States government, of course, we have a lot of different security interests, the FAA being one of them, so we do pay quite a bit of attention to what goes on and participate along with everybody from the Department of Defense to our Transportation Security Agency. So there's a lot of work that's done there, and we collaborate with them extensively on any of those areas. Of course, it's not just at the federal level with more profound issues of national security that we're concerned, but also your privacy issues in local communities where often these small drones are flown. So again, being a resource of working with local law enforcement agencies to address security issues is something the FAA is very involved with.
And one more. I talked to some of the people before the session, those who are those who are developing unmanned aircraft, not inside of this hall. And they claim that in terms of certification, there is no distinction between a small quadcopter and a large drone. True or false?
So when you say a large drone, you mean? Well, give me a size.
Size.
So something beyond 25 kilograms, because that's what we're working on. So anything in the 25 kilograms and below, there would be no requirement for any kind of airworthiness certification. Anything beyond that would, I guess, there would need to be some sort of a certification process. But again, we're not developed to the point where we have those standards. Some of my colleagues here are involved in the certification. They could probably speak to the particulars better than I, but there certainly would be a distinction.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mike. Our next speaker is Yves Maria. The man with great experience, starting with military service, then several authority positions in French CAA, responsible for airworthiness codes and safety studies in rulemaking directorate, head of the office for technical regulations in the same directorate, then joint aviation authorities, regulations director, European Aviation Safety Agency, head of several departments, including product safety, safety information and reporting, general aviation and drones. Also full-time as coordinator for drones activities in EASA since September 2016. He has very impressive education, including French Civil Aviation Academy, INAC in Toulouse. Welcome, Mr. Yves Maria, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I thank the chairman for his very kind words. I also thank ICAO for giving the opportunity to EASA to explain what we do. And I'm certainly honored to be here, and I must admit a bit intimidated to speak in front of such a learned group of people. I will start by a couple of words of perhaps general introduction and a bit of a word of caution. I should make clear that today the regulation of small drones in the European system is in fact the responsibility of our member state, below 150 kilo to sum up. Member states have reacted to the drone arrival. Most of them have developed legislation. Those legislation are somewhat different, and recently operators asked the European Commission to provide more harmonization and have a harmonized approach in Europe for all kind of drones, so starting from 0 kilo to whatever maximum mass. So this is part of a modification of what is our basic regulation, which is a sort of aviation act that defines the responsibility of the Commission, our member state, and of EASA. And we have In parallel to that modification, which actually is not only for drones but for other matters, EASA has been asked to develop what could be a draft for a regulatory framework in Europe for the operation of first small drones and afterwards the certified, what we call the certified category. So what I'm going to present to you is a proposal that we have made. It's an example how we could harmonize in a region. It's not firmed yet. What we call an NPA, so Notice of Proposed Amendments, a regulatory consultation, ended up on Friday. And we have received 3,300 comments from 220 organizations. So it means that we will have certainly to do a very serious review and that there is a lot of work to do. But it also shows the great interest for making a harmonized proposal in a region. What we are drafting is operation-centric. The reasons are quite simple. As there is up to now nobody into the drones, the consequences of an event are actually extremely related to the area of operation, be it population on the ground or airspace. So it has to be operation-centric in our view, and it has also advantages because you can establish a balance between the requirements, technical requirements, pilot competence requirements that we will see later on. It has to be performance-based, or as much as possible performance-based. We have tried to do that in particular for the technical requirement for the drones. And it has to be risk-based. The consequences of an event are highly related to kinetic energy. We couldn't have a continuum, so we decided to use 3 categories: open, where it's the lower risk; specific, where you have an increased risk; and finally certified for the higher risk. I must say this concept, operation-centric, plus the categories, are very much inspired from what has been done by the JARUS organization that Mike will present in a moment. So I just wanted to show an example where we have been using a concept developed in an international organization in which we do participate. I'd just like to highlight a couple of points in this. What does it contain, open and specific? So basically, essentially, small drones at the time being. I'm not going to highlight all of the key points, but certainly registration, identification and geofencing are key to that proposal. It has been made for enforcement, safety, privacy reason, and it also finds now an interest into UTM. We have also, I think, innovated, at least in Europe, in how to identify and how to require technical requirement for the drones themselves. We have not used our airworthiness certification system. We have used, in fact, the product legislation, which is applicable to consumer product, and which lead to the so-called CE marking. So we have used a different system for the technical requirement than what we use for normal aircraft. It's clear also that our NPA, our proposals, we wish to, in there, take into account, contribute to security and privacy. I use contribute because we have no particular mandate, or we have not a complete mandate in security, and in terms of privacy, we have no mandate at all. But we think that a rule that we produce must at least address those issues in some form. And we have also already received comments that we may not have done enough in that respect. Finally, the last point I'd like to address is model aircraft. We have addressed model aircraft under that legislation, recognizing, in fact, the good safety record obtained by the modelists, and we have provided ways for them to have a sort of specific favorable treatment in our rule. The reason to do that was that it's quite difficult to distinguish technically between an unmanned aircraft and a model aircraft. You have seen that there are different approaches, and we may be a bit perhaps solitary in that way. Coming to our categories, I try to highlight first the first open category. The main idea is that there is no pre-authorization required, and we have, as it covers a range of drones between 0 and 25 kilos. We felt that it was not possible to address them in only with one rule. We have created subcategories: fly over people, fly close to people, fly far to people. I'm sure that this will be discussed a lot during the comments, but that was a driver for the subcategories. When you go out of the open category, so for example, you operate a drone of above 25 kilos, or you're operating beyond visual line of sight, then you fall into the specific category, which is in fact a way to address more complex operation, and this rely in principle on a risk assessment. I'll describe it in a minute. Risk assessment produced by the operator, which lead to an authorization in that case, when the authority, the member state is in agreement, lead to an authorization. However, we felt that requiring systematically a risk assessment for the operation could be burdensome for both authorities and the member state. We have proposed a concept of standard scenarios, which is a sort of a standardized operation for which the risk assessment has been done in advance and for which the mitigating measures are also agreed in advance. So that should simplify actually the work of an operator. The other way to I would say, address this problem of burden was to create, in fact, an optional operator certificate. You could say, okay, certificate means that you will have to demonstrate a number of things, but we wanted to give privileges so that there is an investment at the beginning, but the privilege could be up to the operator approving its own operation, of course, after a certain experience, and for the most experienced operators. How did we dealt with the open category? Sorry. So, of course, we have two risks to address, ground risk and air risk. It's also true for the specific category, I should hasten to say. But, in fact, we handle the open category, so no pre-authorization, by establishing a balance between remote pilot competence, technical requirements, and operational limitation. I think that was, in fact, the interest of a operation-centric concept, because we could establish this kind of balance, and we found that quite beneficial. Of course, the limitation, it's above 25, it's below 25 kilo. We have the main other one is a maximum height, and finally the key one to me is visual line of operation, because that's how you really ensure the safety vis-à-vis other aircraft. That's how modelists, for example, have operated for years. Concerning the technical requirements, we have established 5 classes of drone, and the requirements are also related, are risk related. And finally, remote pilot competence. We have asked, of course, for a leaflet to be put into the box when you buy a drone, giving some fundamental elements. When the risk grow, we want to do some online training. And finally, when we have a higher risk in the open category still, a certificate of competence. Okay, all this looks a little bit complex, but we have tried to, in fact, to ease the adoption of our rule by proposing leaflets which are adapted to each of the various classes of drone, where the essential elements to be known by someone who flies the drone are summed up. So this is one example of what I think is a very important exercise, which is awareness of the pilot of the drones, as we have heard several times this morning. Concerning the specific category, so as I said, it relies on a risk assessment. This risk assessment is in fact has a broad scope, as you can see on this slide. It addresses areas of operation, airspace, but also the design of the drone, the pilot competence. We intend to use a methodology which has been developed by the JARUS, which is called a Specific Operation Risk Assessment. And that's another example of us using the work done by JARUS. And pilot competence is part of the risk assessment. So the risk assessment will tell what is the necessary competence of the pilot. It could be up to a license, for example. Another element that we have introduced in our NPA is we wanted to provide flexibility for member states. That was quite a clear wish from our member state. We agreed to it. And we have introduced the concept of zones that are to be, in fact, the actual zones have to be adopted by the member states. They are of two categories, those that either forbid or limit, and on the other hand, those that facilitate, in fact, operation of drones, for example, for flight testing. So you could see in red those that forbid or limit, and in green, the one that provide alleviation in order to do flight testing or alleviation for the modelist. We have envisaged an applicability of our rule by assuming our basic regulation is modified, so EU get competence for small drones by the end of 2017. That our regulation could be adopted, this NPA could be adopted in 2018, then we have a sort of implementation dates around 2021. We have a particular challenge for 2019 because that's where our commissioner wished to see a U-space or a UTM operational, and that will influence, I would say, the work we need to do on registration, identification, and geofencing. We have some further regulatory work. So the next step for this open and specific category is to publish our opinion to the Commission, so the proposal to the Commission by January 2018, which is quite a steep challenge, but we are trying to respond to the sense of urgency. What we need to work also with urgency is the standards which are supporting the technical requirements. We have also to work on the standard scenarios, try to define some of them at least, because they are key to the specific category. And finally, we work with perhaps a bit of a lower priority, but we work on it too, on the category certified, which would correspond in fact to the work of the RPAS panel. And we have a notice of proposed amendment by the first or second quarter 2018. A quick word about UTM. So it's an important element in the drone legislation. Some elements that registration, identification, and geofencing are in the pillars to the UTM or U-space, as we say in Europe, approach. Finally, some other activities. We have a lot of cooperation, of course, with our member state, with the Commission and our stakeholder. We are quite active in international cooperation, ICAO, JARUS, and we have close contact with our colleagues from the FAA. One element I would like to highlight on this slide is the importance of safety promotion, that is to say how to raise awareness of the pilots, of the public. And finally, I wanted to put this slide as a sort of an outlook. I will not get into much detail about it, although I would love it, but I will not. It's in fact to say we are seeing now flying objects which are relying on drone technology, which are also relying on electrical propulsion in a more or less sophisticated way. And they will carry passengers. There may be a pilot on board, there may be no pilot on board, so we will have a number of autonomous issues to resolve. And they are coming. If you look at plans like for Uber or Airbus, it may be before 2025. They will be operating in the UTM, in the same airspace as a drone, and my only wish here is to say, keep them in mind, they are coming, and that's another dimension of the problem. Or the challenges, I think, as we say now. On this, thank you very much for your attention. I hope, Mr. Moderator, I was not too long, and I'm ready to answer any questions under the moderator guidance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morier. I will ask you only one question, and only because there are several which came from the audience, and they are addressed not only to you, but also to the FAA. We'll wait until the end of the session. But my question is related to the slide which is on the screen, specifically the technical challenges and batteries. We all know how much attention ICAO pays to the batteries, and they prove to be pretty unreliable fishes in our industry. So is it conceivable that battery failure may result in some very undesirable circumstances, and what are the regulations which require for quality of the batteries? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say, okay, if a battery failure happens on some of those designs, they will fall. So there will be undesired consequences, as you say. I don't have the necessary. I must say, I don't have the answer right now. I just wanted to highlight this is a problem that we need to look at. It's a technical problem for the machine because it needs to have a certain endurance, but it has also a number of safety considerations, like, as you say, the failure of the batteries or the risk of fire. So there is quite a host of issues to be addressed, and we need to put attention to that. But I don't have the detailed technical requirement as of yet. I just wanted to more draw the attention of the people of this new category of aircraft and a couple of technical challenges that we will need to address in order to respond, I would say, to a lot of development. I guess there are 20 different prototypes of this kind of machine which are either flying or under project. So it's something we need to look into.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you again, Monsieur Morier. And I would like to turn now to the speaker number 4, Mike Lissone. Mike is Secretary General for the JARUS. He has more than 35 years of experience in ATM at an operational and regulatory level, including civil military ATM-related aspects. Mike was responsible for several airspace design projects with Eurocontrol, and he was developer of the PBN Airspace Concept Workshop. Mike has validated advanced airspace design concept with a RNP. From 2008, Mike was RPAS ATM Integration Manager in Eurocontrol, where he was the main contributor and editor of the EC R&D roadmap. He has been the Eurocontrol member of several working groups and panels. He is the chairman of the ATM Integration Working Group, WG6. Mike, please.
Good afternoon. JARUS. Already heard that my background is ATM, so I have to put on my other hat, the JARUS hat. JARUS basically stands for Joint Authorities Rulemaking of Unmanned Aircraft Systems. It started some years ago when a good friend of mine, Ron van der Leijgraaf, was faced by many regulators by a white piece of paper. How to develop regulations for these drones, what they call them now, or the small UASs, and how to approach this further. So the best idea was to basically start working with other states, basically having the same problems, how to move forward and how to manage this system into a well, safe manner and such much. And on that part, we basically started comparing bruises and scars, and then moved forward in trying to develop rules and regulations and proposals and where we are now. You can see we have quite a lot of member states, 52 member states and 2 organizations, in total 54 of them, working together on this side. So not all of them, of course, are working very hard on all the work that we are doing at this moment, but most of the people are there learning from what's happening, and what we're trying to do is create a level playing field for people to understand the same problems at the same level and to move forward this way. We also have the stakeholder consultation body. When we started, we had a lack of industry support on that side. Also, at that moment, it was not a real place to bring industry in there. We started in 2015 to bring the industry on board in the stakeholder consultation body, and this is working perfectly fine. They are also contributing actively into the working group, so that is a real good way forward in having industry support, especially on the more technical issues. The working structure of JARUS consists of 7 working groups, and I'll go into more detail in the next slide. Working Group 1, the flight crew licensing part, they have delivered that part already. We have Working Group 2 working on the operations, Working Group 3 working on airworthiness, and Working Group 4 doing detect and avoid. Working Group 5 doing command control and communications, 6 working on The safety and the risk management, the other group basically is responsible for developing the SORA part. And last but not least, Working Group 7 working on the concept of operations, which Yves already showed what the EASA has embraced. And I still remember young Stephen George working on that quite some time ago. So the deliverables are nothing more than recommendations. So what we deliver here is not law, it's not mandatory, it's a recommendation, and it's up to the states to do whatever they want with that part. A good example is Germany took the SORA, the LBA has rewritten SORA to match the requirements for Germany, but it's totally up to them to do whatever they want and what basically fits best on that side. And that also means that we have a very light organization, and that's also the part where we are able to adapt quite fast to new needs. So this is a whole list of our deliverables. I won't go into detail on that part because I understand also that I'm the last presentation as such. And this is basically showing, oh, look at what we have done. But they have done a lot already since 2013. A lot of these deliverables being used by the member states and also being used as educational part for a lot of the members and the member states who are basically confronted with this new part. And be honest, we're in the middle of an industrial revolution. This is all about robotics, artificial intelligence, and RPAS is certainly a part of it. And we are a very conservative organization, normally from an ATM perspective. We work on an evolutionary basis, and now we're confronted with a progress and a process that goes so fast, it's completely different. We hope through the JARUS part at least that we can educate the regulators and help them move forward on that part. Upcoming activities, the SORA. Specific operational risk assessment, it's quite innovative. It's not finished as such because we're still waiting on the annexes, but it's a new way of looking at the risks and sharing the risk with the airspace users. It's a good way forward, have a look at it. And if you have any comments, please send them to us, we're most willing to have anything there. Currently on the development, we have the Ops category on the A and B part of our Working Group 2. The C category is done by Working Group 4. We have the RPAS C2 link that has just been launched, so my slide is not completely up to date. And last but not least, of course, the constant operation of Working Group 7. So this is quick and fast explaining to you what JARUS is all about. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I have quite a few questions, starting with the purpose of JARUS. It says development of single set of technical safety and operational requirements. Looking at the composition of JARUS, there are only 52 states. And this is roughly 25% of the ICAO membership. You have some states from Africa, South Africa and Kenya. You have 2 states from Latin America, Brazil and Colombia. What about the rest? I'm talking about the coordination.
It's a very good question, and I was hoping, of course, that these questions would be very simple, but it's not the case. We basically try to expand our knowledge as much as possible to the JARUS websites and reach out to most of the member states, but most of these member states that you mentioned make it very difficult also for them to travel to the organization parts on that side. So we try to spread also do symposia like this, what we are doing, and to share our products as free as possible. But it's a big challenge, and I fully agree. We only have 52 member states, but still I think that's quite a lot.
One more question. It's more like a technical question. And I'm trying to imagine the higher and lower airspace and requirement for the pilot and the ATM to have full awareness of the situation. What are you going to rely on, and whether there are some tools which will require to be brought in for verification?
Wow, that's a bit a different topic. Might know where that question comes from, but okay, I'll keep it in the middle. Verification of the surveillance part is very important. So that is something that basically is there for the bigger ones, the IFR ones, and for the smaller ones. For IFR, we have all kinds of procedure in place. ATC is there also to confirm these issues, and that's been working quite well for quite a long time. Looking at the smaller ones, I think there is quite a lot of RPAS expected, and if we basically provide them with surveillance, I believe a lot of people are hoping that ADS-B might be the wonderful solution or the silver bullet to give them situational awareness and maybe even link that to detect and avoid. For Europe, I can only say that we have an infrastructure relying on 1090 megahertz. It is not designed to cope for thousands or maybe even millions, looking at the slide from the FAA, to cover that element there. Any tracking system that will be in place by that time will need verification, because we're not going to manage them like ATC, so there will not be a verification if this drone is drone ABC 1, 2, 3 or not. So for the smaller ones, I think the verification part is going to be even more important, also from a cybersecurity perspective. I hope I answered it correctly.
Well, thank you very much. There are many other questions which I would like now, and thank you, Mike. You can be seated.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now I will open the box with the questions coming from the audience, and I'm not sure that we will be able to cover all of them, but we will try as much as possible if the panel will cooperate and try to answer in a succinct manner. Question for status of regulatory framework. Please, can the FAA and EASA representatives explain how their organizations are using the JARUS outputs, for example, the specific operations risk assessments? FAA and EASA, please.
So I think that it's probably a reverse process for us. I think it's we, through our engagement at JARUS, have tried to infuse within the JARUS organization our principles as far as safety risk management, and to, of course, combine that with the expertise of the other members as well, and try to rotate that back into our rulemaking efforts. Of course, any rulemaking project that we undertake at the FAA, as any regulator throughout the world would, includes an extensive safety risk management process and review that's not entirely dissimilar to what is proposed through the JARUS SORA process. So we see a lot of similarities for that, even if there isn't a formal throughput mechanism at this point.
Thank you. Monsieur Morier.
Okay, thank you for that question. I believe I addressed it during my presentation, so I will complement it by, we have made a policy statement was certainly said by the Commission, EU Commission, I mean. Our management is that we will use JARUS material whenever it is of a good quality and when it is timely. We have to take into account of our priority of work. But I gave two examples. One is clearly the concept of operation that we have proposed. This concept of operation, we have called it open, specific, and certified. JARUS call it A, B, and C respectively. But certainly we are using it. The other element that we are using at the time, or intend to use at the time being, is the SORA, the Specific Operation Risk Assessment, and this we plan to call it to use it as what we call an acceptable means of compliance to the requirement we put in the specific category for the risk assessment. Another example, which I didn't highlight, is that the Working Group 6 is developing also scenarios, sort of standard scenarios, and I think that we are also going to consider them into the catalog of standard scenario we will produce. So clearly we use JARUS material. Thank you.
Thank you. Question to Leslie. I wonder if drones lighter than 25 kilograms crossing border lines doing commercial air work are going to be subject to ICAO regulation.
There will be a fine line that we are trying to put in place. So a small drone crossing an international border is technically within the ICAO purview. as is a small drone operating at an airport that is accommodating international manned flights. However, trying to do standards for those drones is not something we can do under the convention. So we will be developing material, but it'll be in the form of guidance, not standards. So there will be material coming forward.
Good. Thank you, Leslie. And I would like to remind the audience that I'm now reading the questions which came from you. The next one is addressed again to the FAA and EASA. I'm reading, I understand that end of 2017 there will be a new regulation allowing drone flights over people. Does that apply to both FAA and EASA?
So the presentation I gave, I mentioned that we were going to have published, hopefully by December, a notice of proposed rulemaking. So the rule will not actually be in place, only the proposal, and that will go out for public comment, and we'll adjudicate those comments. And so we're still a ways yet from being at that point at the FAA.
Yes, thank you for the question. In our open category, we have classified the subcategory. We have three subcategories, which we have organized in the direction of flyover people. So our NPA actually already today address the case of flying over people. However, I need to be quite precise that we mean isolated people. We don't mean a gathering of people. If it would be flying continuously above a gathering of people, this could be, and I would say irrespective of the mass of the drone, actually either a specific category or event certified category. So for us, we have started already to look at the case of flying over people. So again, isolated people can be in the open category, but with very low mass machine. And if it is not that, it has to be addressed at least in the specific category. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, and by the way, if somebody has not used the application and still wants to ask question, the raising of the hand will allow for this. The next question, it has been highlighted today by a number of speakers, the importance of RPAS harmonization, but now can that ever be achieved, but how can that ever be achieved when there is still no general agreement and consistent use of definition and terminology by the regulators? Who wants to handle this? Leslie?
I will have a try. Okay, I think I would agree that probably achieving absolute harmonization word for word will be quite a difficult exercise. But if we, for example, go along a system of already operation-centric, performance-based, risk-based kind of operation, so that if we have already those elements, that would go quite a long way. We are also trying to harmonize and discuss as much as we can into bodies like ICAO, into JARUS, and when it comes to our bilateral partners, I mean Europe bilateral partners like the FAA, we are also considering. It's not yet done, it will be a lot of work, but to also put the drones as being a major industry into the bilateral. So we were exploring that approach, the advantage of a bilateral, that it gives way how to accept, I would say, other systems when they meet the objective of the other one. So there are several ways. I must also add that in our NPA, one of the principles we have introduced the idea, okay, how are we going to handle third country operators, so coming from outside Europe and operating in Europe. We have only general principle here, which is to say, okay, comply with our rule unless there has been an assessment of the foreign country regulation which could allow us to accept certain elements. So I think if we try the word for word, I'm not sure we will succeed, but if we agree on a number of basic principles like the one I was mentioning, And if we make good use of various other tools like the bilaterals, we can go quite a long way to simplify the acceptance of each other products or each other operations. I mean, it's a lot of work, but there are ways.
Good, thank you. No hands in the air. I continue with reading the questions. What actions are you taking to gather lessons learned from member states for their experience/knowledge that can go into the standards for small UAS? And though the question was specifically addressed to one person, but I would like to keep it open to all of you.
Like I mentioned already briefly in my presentation, what we mostly have is when we have new states joining JARUS, it's for them something completely new. And that's also the drive for the harmonization part. The moment you create a common understanding of the issues, a common understanding of the regulatory and the technical issues, that basically drives forward the harmonization part. That's why with manned aviation we don't have these issues. So there are different levels of understanding, different level of technical understanding that we need to drive forward. So within JARUS, when we have new people coming around, we try to support them as much as possible in trying to educate them very lightly, but to basically point them in the right direction. What we've done in Eurocontrol is that for the member states there, we provide the member states with a basic understanding of creating an RPAS community. Creating a common understanding, but also making connections, specifically to the smaller ones, where you have the community, because normally these are not the normal connections you have within manned aviation. They don't exist. And to make these people talk to each other, because a drone operator wants to fly. And if you are a new drone operator, and if you're commercial, you don't really care about ATM or regulations. You want to fly. And then the ATM part is there, the regulatory part is there, and these three have to marry. So like I mentioned before, from an ATM perspective, we are very conservative, although the regulatory part is very conservative. And you have to carry on with very innovative people and make them understand that they cannot run, but they need to learn to walk first. It's a big challenge.
Thank you. Please.
I will try to respond. Well, when we created this notice of proposed amendment, we had an expert group in which we had, I believe, around 10 of our member states being present. So by having them present in the group, we could benefit of their experience. And I would just propose one example of where it was important to have our member state input is when we were discussing the specific category with the concept of a risk assessment that an operator should present to an authority in order to get approved. A number of them said it's going to be quite burdensome, both for the operators and the authority. So that's where we decided to create, based on that real direct feedback, to create this concept of standard scenarios, which are sort of, as I said, a predefined operation with a predefined risk assessment and predefined mitigation measures. And we will continue in EASA to listen intently to our member state. One perhaps bit of difficulty, but this is not a critique to anyone, is that they may not always have the same view. So it's not, the convergence is not always automatic, but certainly from our work, we need to work closely with our member states.
Thank you, Yves.
For the FAA, our engagement with JARUS and with ICAO has been a very rich source of information that we've been able to use in helping to shape some of our regulations and policies. We also follow very closely the work of our colleagues at EASA, and again, our engagement with industry, both formal engagement and in the way of waiver processing and informal through consultations, has also done a great deal to help us in shaping our rules and policies going forward.
You don't have to.
All right, I don't want to go into too much detail because that will actually steal or give too much advance notice of what's coming up in Drone Enable, but I will say that ICAO put together the UAS advisory group a year and a half ago, and it has been working on a lot of guidance material that we have located online for states to consider as they are developing their regulations. All of the material that is there takes into consideration best practices from states who were engaged with that development process, as well as operators and some manufacturers. So we've done quite a bit of outreach already, but we will have a lot more coming up through Drone Enable. And then if I may just go back on the previous question for a moment.
Please do.
So in terms of other regulatory work and how we try to drive the harmonization globally, that is exactly what ICAO's role and responsibility is. It's to develop harmonized standards through a very engaged process, working with the states on what those standards will be. States then have an obligation to adopt the standards into their legislation. So that's a strong commitment between the member states of ICAO and ICAO. So we put a great deal of emphasis onto developing standards that will be effective and applicable globally. And then we even go back afterwards and conduct audits of states to determine how effectively they are implementing those standards. So that does come down all the way to definitions, which is why we spend a lot of time focusing on definitions here. But we do not have complete success. As Yves mentioned, even from ICAO, we cannot get full compliance with states. So earlier I put up the definition of aircraft. There are about 4 or 5 states out there around the world that define aircraft differently. And as a result, unmanned aircraft are not aircraft. So we start with a problem right there. If they're not aircraft, how can we regulate them under aircraft regulations? Just as one small example when things don't quite match up.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I believe that the time will not allow us to answer all the questions, but I would like to encourage those, and I can even give names, but you know who has sent questions and they were not answered. Please come along after the session is over and talk to the panel. I hope that I am not misusing my privilege and invite people to talk to you. I think that we have had an excellent review of the regulations which are already in existence and under development. And I can only conclude that this very important issue is in the hands of very able people and the organizations which are designed for this. And we should not have any doubt that eventually the regulatory framework will allow us to use these technological advancements to the benefit of our industries. I also would like to acknowledge the either existing cooperation and coordination or the coordination which is intended. And I would like to encourage all the 4 organizations to continue doing this because it's extremely important, not only amongst you, but also with those who are absent, either on your boards or in this audience. I recall from the implementation of CNS ATM many years ago when I was responsible for global coordination that it's an extremely important process to involve everybody, especially in aviation. On a personal note, I would like to thank members of the panel for lively discussion which we had, and I hope that it satisfied the audience as much as we can do within an hour and a half. But the issue is, of course, a huge one. So I'm inviting you to give your round of applause to the members of the panel. Last point from me. I teased you with this little piece of art. And what is interesting that nobody, absolutely nobody, attempted to go to the internet and to find the answer to this question, which to me is a very good sign. It means that you didn't want to deviate from the discussion, and for this I would like to thank you very much. But at the same time I would like to give you the answer. Samuel Morse was famous not only for the Morse code, but he was an excellent painter. And at your leisure, you can have a look at the sources, and you will be amazed how a wonderful painter he was. Because there was no attempt to answer the question, I would like to take my personal decision. I'm still king for another minute, and I'm giving this to Leslie, who is the moderator, the speaker, and the inspiration behind this symposium. And thank you very much.
Wow, what a day. What a day this has been, huh? We started with a very strong message from the President of the Council of ICAO, Dr. Olumuyiwa Bernarda Liu, followed by keynote speakers, states distinguished representative from Italy, US, and Singapore. We have concluded the morning listening to the industry representatives such as Association for Unmanned Vehicle System International, IATA, CANSO, ACI, and Aerospace and Defense Industries Association of Europe. For me, the takeaway from that and those presentations and messages were common regulatory framework, shared commitment to safety, and/or further dedication of resources to ICAO future work. After lunch, we set the tone by interacting with panel members from Frontex, European Border Coast Guard Agency, NASA, United Nations, as well as General Atomics Aeronautical System Incorporated, and learn about some current operations and training experiences from around the world. During the last session of the day, we had the pleasure to better understand the status of regulatory framework from representative of ICAO, FAA, EASA, and JARUS, well summarized by Vladimir Zubkov, the Secretary General of TIACA. On a different note, many thanks to Leslie, her team, the entire ICAO staff for the amazing guidance they gave us during the first day of the symposium. Now, before ending the day, I would like to kindly ask you, be back tomorrow morning, not later than 9 o'clock sharp, so that we may begin on time and get the full measure of what promises to be another day of discovering and sharing. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.